Up until now, you've seen me demonstrate quite a few things, and often when I'm exposure blending, you'll notice that I make certain exposures invisible when I generate masks. And it's very important to understand exactly why we do that. Fortunately, this is quite a simple thing to understand. The reason why we make our darker exposure invisible or our brightest exposure invisible and leave our base exposure visible is because often this will give us the best possible selection of the area that we want to select. What I mean by that is, when we generate masks, I'm going to open up Instamask and just press Brights 1. And Brights 1 is a perfect copy of the image that you see here. It's just in black and white. So whatever we have on the screen here as our big image, that is what Brights 1 will create. So there's the base exposure and there's Bright 1. Now watch what happens if I make the dark exposure visible. Now I press Bright 1, and now the mask is a perfect black and white copy of the dark exposure. See, that's the mask, that's the dark exposure. So whatever we have visible on our screen, that's the mask that's going to be created. So the question we have to ask ourselves when we're exposure blending is, which exposure gives us the best selection of the area that we're interested in? So in this example, and in most examples, it will be your base exposure, because we've got too much information in the darker exposures. And we'll talk about blending in a brighter exposure in the next example. But for now, let's just talk about blending in a darker exposure. So if I just make this darker exposure invisible again, and I generate a Brights 1 mask, we now have a relatively white sky. There are some light grey patches in there, but that's a really good selection of our sky. And if we bring along our sliders in Instamask, we can strengthen that selection even more, making the sky nice and white. Now naturally we don't want to select these mountains in our mask because we want to keep that information from the base exposure. We just want to take the sky from the darker exposure and put it into that brighter exposure. So we need a mask which will select the sky without selecting the mountains. So if I'm happy with that, I can choose the dark exposure, press Apply and Show Layer. And you see we've blended those exposures beautifully. But what happens if I leave this exposure visible, the darker exposure? I do exactly the same thing. I build a Brights 1 mask, and then I select the darker exposure and press Apply. Now we haven't got a very good final result at all. The sky should be a lot darker. Just to show you a comparison, I'm going to duplicate this dark layer, delete the mask on it, make all these layers invisible, and just generate that same mask that we did before, and press Apply. So this is what it should look like, but this is what the blend looked like using the dark exposure mask. And to show you an even quicker before and after example, I'm going to duplicate this layer, put it up here, and create a little group here, and make this layer visible. So this is the result from the correct mask, and that's after we masked using the darker exposure mask. You see there's a huge difference there. Now, if you're unsure, or when it comes to exposure blending you forget what you're supposed to do or the reason why you're supposed to do it, the simple rule is always make your darker exposure invisible and make your base exposure visible. That's all you need to remember really when it comes to blending in darker exposures. But the question I always ask myself is, which exposure gives me the best possible selection of the area that I'm interested in? And clearly out of these two exposures, the base exposure is perfect. Let me show you a second example of this. So here we have a darker exposure on top and we have our base exposure, and I've duplicated these exposures here. Now, as usual, I'm going to make a mask from our base exposure. So I've made our dark mask invisible and I create a Brights 1 mask. Let's create a Brights 3 mask to give us a better selection. Now if we zoom into this mask, you'll see that we've got a little bit of information there. So we can bring our slider along to get rid of that information. And that should just about do it. Now if I select our dark exposure and press Apply, you can see that's done a pretty good blend. And that's because the areas we want to select in our base exposure are virtually white, making it really easy to develop a mask around it. Let's delete that mask and build the mask around the darker exposure. So I'm going to go back to Brights 3. Now look at the areas in Brights 3. This has made it so that the area we want to select is no longer white or light grey. There are different tones of grey throughout. So we have dark grey, 50% grey, light grey. So if I add that to our mask, and by the way, even if we press C mask and try and bring the slider along, it's still not going to make a great difference because we've still got much of this internal part visible, whereas we want this to be white. So if I select our dark exposure and press apply, that's the final result. And you see it didn't give us the result we want. Again, just to show you that in comparison to the mask that we developed on the base exposure, I'm going to create a Brights 3, can bring the slider along a little bit, select the darker exposure and press apply. And now we've blended those exposures. So there's the before and after. So there's the comparison showing you the difference between the two masks. So when it comes to exposure blending, we should always try to make our base exposure visible, so that's what we can build the mask around. Now, just to show you that Instamask does create a mask based on the image that we see here, if I make these invisible and I create a new layer and I choose a paintbrush and I just do a J in the middle of the screen like that. Now when I press Brights 1, you see we've now created a mask just as before, but now it's got a big J in front of the screen. So whatever we see here, that's what our mask is going to be built around. If I delete that and I create a black and white layer, this is what our base exposure looks like in black and white. And it looks incredibly familiar, doesn't it? It's exactly the same as the Instamask that we created with Brights 1. They are the exact same image. And so when it comes to blending in a brighter exposure into a base exposure, as you're going to see in the next few tutorials, it's usually best to make the brighter exposure invisible too, although you don't always have to. But to make things much easier, if you just stick with the idea that if you're blending in 2 or 3 exposures, it's always best to make the brighter exposure and the darker exposure invisible and to build any mask around our base exposure. Now, after this video, you're going to get quite a few opportunities to follow along with me as I'm editing. So in many of the videos, you'll see the example images. You can load them into Photoshop and follow along. And each time I create a mask, I'm going to make certain layers invisible. And I'm going to explain why I'm doing that each time so you can further your understanding of how we build masks around certain exposures.